Scott is going to take you on a journey through the ages. A journey some of you may have traveled, and to others it could just be a myth. That I am here to show was not a myth. It was all facts.
I'm about to take you back to 2004 when World of Warcraft first launched and then go forward over 7 years looking at the evolution of Druid. Well, specifically the Balance Druid, or more commonly referred to as the Moonkin or the Boomkin. The thing is, 2004 you couldn't call it that because it didn't even exist. What we did have, actually Morgan, what did we have?
In 2004, we had rovers landing on Mars, a devastating tsunami in Indonesia, a global economy reaching a 30-year high, and then this.
And then we had Druids thinking they could do DPS with balance talents as well. I mean, talk about a crazy year. Much like when we spoke about the Feral Druid throughout the years, 2004 was a very different time compared to what it is fresh in our memory from Classic. Honestly, whilst a progressive patch system in Classic WoW would have been horrific, because most classes from patch to patch went through major changes and so many things were broken for all classes, not just Druids. It'd have still been pretty fun though. It'd have been a fun thing to experience how it actually was instead of the polished turd that we ended up with, which we called WoW Classic. But look, Balance Druids were neglected throughout most of Vanilla, while Blizzard actually spent more time trying to make the Feral Druid more competitive, which they failed at miserably. When I said there was no such thing as Moonkin in 2004, that's because it wasn't even added to the talents until patch 1.8, which was October 2005. Until then, they had a ridiculously overpowered end talent in place of it. You might have heard of it before because of its amazing damage. It's called Hurricane. Yeah, that's right. Originally, there was no Moonkin, and Hurricane was a talent. This isn't a resto video, so I won't even mention Innovate. Oh, alright, I will. It was the final talent in Resto. So yes, if you think you've had mana problems in Classic or in TBC as a Balance Druid, try having no Innovate. On top of that, you know how irritating it is when you hurricane a pack of ads and one of the mobs gets loose and hits you and you lose ticks of your 1 minute cooldown AoE. You're there like, mate, all you need to do is press Bark Skin before you hurricane. It's easy. Actually, you couldn't even do that because back until 1.3, we didn't even have Bark Skin. Yeah, you heard me right. No Bark Skin, no Moonkin, no Innovate. It wasn't even a Balance Druid, was it? You know, Balance before patch 1.7 was actually a solid PvP choice though, giving good control and some healing utility. They were actually broken up until this point and went through lots of changes. The stun mechanic, for example, from your improved Starfire couldn't even be resisted up until this point. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but come on, I mean, it's definitely broken. That on top of the fact Roots, for a very long time throughout the original Vanilla, could just be kept up 100% of the time, making melee literally a free lunch. Overall though, a Balance Druid would never be raiding with a serious guild, because even early on when the skill levels were really low, the knowledge levels were even lower than the skill levels, it didn't take long to realise that they just can't DPS. Starfire, even back then, it hit reasonably hard, and the issue was never how hard they hit. It was the fact that after a few casts, even mana pots wouldn't be able to get you through a full fight. Take into consideration as well that the fight lengths would have been a hell of a lot longer back then compared to what we're used to in Classic, because you didn't have servers full of people communicating and organising world buffs. Getting an Onyxia head buff, for example, would have just been random. You could literally go months without even seeing one. How you think of a Moonkin in Classic is completely different to what it actually was like in 2004, because even though mana was less of an issue in Classic and you could actually get through an entire fight, this is only because you had the spec at its final state of Vanilla and we steamrolled every boss in such a short space of time. I mean, just look at Ragnaros, the first end boss of a raid that you'll face. If you saw the Suns, you was doing it wrong, and if you don't know what the Suns are, it's probably because you never saw them. You didn't even know what the Sun's phase was. It's the hardest part of the fight, and most of the time, completely ignored. Balance Druid in Vanilla was just not something you see, not even see occasionally in raids or dungeons. What you saw were Resto Druids, and quite honestly, almost exclusively Resto Druids. Would TBC change this painful affair for our wannabe caster DPS Druids? Morgan?
Actually, yes. Lots of issues were addressed. Bugs were squashed, and refinement happened to make this era a pleasant one.
Well, yes, actually, and it's not all about the damage either. Some of the mana issues are eased, and I say eased because they weren't eliminated, but with the introduction of Dream State, it definitely helped, which gave mana per 5. There really wasn't that much of a requirement for Balance Druids in raids before now, but just the addition of improved Fairy Fire definitely earned you a raid spot. giving all your melee and range DPS, this isn't casters by the way, just your hunters and your melee, but giving all of them 3% hit means they can drop hit gems or hit off of their gear for more gear that's got damage, more crit, more haste, more whatever, you get the point. So the more melee and hunters you have, actually the more powerful this talent became, or becomes if you're still playing now. Now all you need is a decent Balance Druid who can actually keep it up 100% of the time and they don't get carried away spamming Starfire. So Balance Druids also got 4% hit from talents which we didn't have before, and a lot more spell power and just beefiness to our Starfire and our Wrath. There wasn't massive changes though when we really think of it, not even to playstyle, because even though you wouldn't be using your Moonfire or Insect Swarm in vanilla due to the debuff cap, they were still there. You still had your Hurricane, that 1 minute cooldown AoE, which quite honestly for the mana cost was quite lackluster. With no real DPS cooldowns, a final talent point where you summon a few Groots. I am Groot! Thank you. Which is also pretty useless, and outside of Hibernate having no real solid CC. Yes, before you say it, you could argue Cyclone here, which was added in TBC, but it's a short CC, not a long reliable CC like a Polymorph or a Banish, a Shackle, or maybe Roots that we might get in the future. Although we've already got Roots, in the future I have a feeling it's going to be a lot more useful. So all of that on top of the fact that you only do sort of middle of the pack damage on the vast majority of the fights. You probably sat there like, well, why the hell would anyone have took a Moonkin, or Boomkin, whatever you want to call it, to a raid in TBC? Well, that 3% hit we've already spoke about, and the crit from your Moonkin aura for the 5% crit for your fellow casters in the group, which as most of you know, was normally Warlocks and an Ellie Shaman, for example. But the combat res, the ability to tank one of the bosses on Hiking Mulgar, yeah that's right, you actually got to tank a boss in TBC as a Boomy, pretty cool. And already said, reasonable damage. Not exceptional, but definitely reasonable. It earns you a spot in raids. You would rarely have more than one in a raid. It's not to say you couldn't take more than one though, especially if you had two groups of casters that could benefit from the crit. The main thing though is the 3% hit only needs one Boomy to keep up. So the second added to the raid isn't bringing as much as the first, if that makes sense. Overall though, the TBC experience for Balance Druids definitely was a better one than vanilla. Was they at their peak of these 7 years though? Definitely not. Let's see what Wrath brought for them.
This is where you could finally pump. Pump like the machine you are. And everyone, and I mean from Andy Dufresne to the Queen of England, would want you in their group.
So Wrath of the Lich King changed Balance Druids in so many ways, and now it's not a class you settle for one of, they actually start to pump some serious big boy numbers, as Morgan just said. I've even had people say to me they would postpone Lich King heroic fights if their Boomies couldn't make the raid night. That sounds crazy, but let's look at why that would even happen. No longer keeping Fairy Fire up for your friends, you now keep it up for you. You get 3% crit from it being up and 3% hit. It's the era of the selfish Moonkin who can melt any single target or pack of targets in front of him. Throughout the content patches of Wrath of the Lich King, the Druid in general went through tons of changes. For example, even at launch of Wrath of the Lich King, Feral Cat Swipe didn't exist. It took a few months to come in. It was Wrath of the Lich King which introduced the first iteration of the Eclipse mechanic though, to Balance Druid specifically, which later through the expansions had many changes and remained one of the big parts of Boomy for years to come. In its first iteration, introduced in Wrath though, it required a few talent points to pick up in the balance tree, and it would cause your Starfire crits an extra 40% damage on your next Wrath spells, and your Wrath crits a 60% chance increase for crit on your next Starfire spells. These effects couldn't both be up at the same time. They'd last for 15 seconds though, and you have 30-second cooldown on each. No pun intended here, but when the stars aligned and you was getting back-to-back procs on cooldown here, oh my god, could you pump on single target. Let's not forget all the AoE capability as well, with Hurricane having no cooldown now, Starfall being an absolute beast, and now having Typhoon to knock them away to continue pumping. Don't get me wrong, some tanks will hate the addition of Typhoon, because the average Druid really would use it to just be a dick. Maybe like me, but because it was really enjoyable, I don't know. What we've spoke about so much up to this point, that's right, is mana issues. Goodbye forever. Spell crits in Boomy form now regen 2% of your max mana. And oh boy, do you crit a lot. You get increased chance to crit from so many different things now, such as just playing as you should play. Insect Swarm on the target, more crit. Fairy Fire on the target, more crit. Wrath really is a great time for Druids as a whole, but definitely Balance Druids specifically. As well as getting an out of combat res, a 13% spell damage taken debuff to the target, being able to Roots indoors to use it as a decent CC, And let's not forget the introduction of the profession Inscription, which meant you could get glyphs to remove reagent requirements, freeing up bag space. Not sure why I closed on that one, but come on, getting bag space back is always cause for celebration. All of this made Wrath of the Lich King a memorable one for Balance Druids. Could Cataclysm build on this momentum Balance Druids have, or pull them back to the reality of a meme class? Morgan?
This is where I have no comment, Scott. It was just shit.
I will always say Cataclysm changed the talent systems for the worse and was the downfall of the talent systems as a whole for me. Balance Druid got some nice new abilities though, and some of them even from talents. Star Surge, a huge single target slap, which also synergises with a talent to get a chance to reset the cooldown and make it instant cast. An AoE Silence, which we had seen nothing like before, in the form of Solar Beam, in case you didn't know. And we definitely shouldn't forget Wild Mushrooms. They'd go invisible for a few seconds and then they would detonate when people get near them, or you could detonate them yourself. I actually remember having a lot of fun with these back in the day, such a unique mechanic. We need to start with a complete overhaul to how the Balance Druid was played though. It no longer had the RNG aspect where you sat and prayed for crits to get Eclipse to proc. You now had an actual Eclipse bar, and the whole system is baked into the spec. Ultimately, the best way to think about it is as a pendulum system, so the pendulum goes back and forth between solar and lunar, and when you reach the end, you get its bonus and a portion of your mana back. So you go spamming Wrath to spamming Starfire, using your Star Surge in there as well, and of course keeping your dots up. Wait, dots? Plural dots. Yes, and I'm not just talking about Insect Swarm and Moonfire, obviously. You get Moonfire still, but you also now get Sunfire. So when you're inside that Eclipse state, your Moonfire will morph into Sunfire. AoE-wise, Balance Druid was incredibly strong and actually had great damage on the move because Moonfire spam started to become viable with the addition of the talent Lunar Shower. On pure single target, it did fall behind the pack a little bit, but fortunately single target bosses was quite rare. There was normally something you could multi-dot with, and that was enough to make you look amazing. The Druid continued to go through many changes over the years, and maybe you'll be able to find out how if I do a part 2 to this video, which would take us from Cata to present day. Be sure to check out the Feral video I done recently, which I'll now put a link to in, where you can look at all the kitty evolution, and until next time, peace out.